Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
Well, good evening, friends, and welcome to this January 27, 2014 edition of Nightcast. This is still January. It's not February yet. You know, a lot of people still write 2013 on their checks. Of course, more people are using credit cards now than they are checks. But anyway, welcome to this 27th of January 2014 edition of Nightcast, friends. Tonight, the opening story in the news, there's no breakthrough in the Geneva talks on the Syria crisis.
The heart of Syria's third biggest city, now in ruins. But the problem in the old city of Homs isn't just physical devastation. Rebel-held areas here have for months been cut off by Syrian government forces. And activists say that for the old and weak and vulnerable, the situation is critical.
It's so bad. After 600 days in a row under siege, there is no food.
In Geneva, it was back to the negotiating table for the two sides in the Syria peace talks. On the agenda this morning, a future transitional government for Syria. And exchanges between the rival delegations have, it seems, been quite combustible.
The regime side, I think, felt very much under pressure and started again using very confrontational language.
Either these people, as I said, have no capacity to express their love and care for Syria, or they don't have anything, or they are ordered by foreign powers to ignore what is most important and most urgent for their countries.
But also on everyone's minds, easing that Homs siege and whether Damascus will give a green light for UN convoys. Not yet, according to the Syrian opposition.
There are 12 trucks of Red Crescent waiting there for the regime to allow them in, but they are not allowed yet. We will judge the regime but by what it does, not by what it says.
From early on in this three-year conflict, Homs has been bombarded and, according to activists, is still being shelled daily. Yesterday, the Syrian government announced women and children, but not men, were free to leave the city. But it's convoys the UN wants to see go in, not an evacuation. Getting UN aid convoys into Homs was supposed to be an easy thing for President Assad to say yes to, a test of his cooperation. But if he doesn't agree, and if the political talks here in Geneva this morning have run into deadlock, well, then hopes of early progress for this Syrian peace process may have been too ambitious. Bridget Kendall, BBC News, Geneva.
Thank you, Bridget. Friends, we go to Egypt next. Egypt's top military body has given its approval for Army Chief Field Marshal Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to run for the presidency. According to the state media, Field Marshal Sisi led the overthrow of President Mohamed Morsi, Egypt's first democratically elected leader, in July 2013. He was overthrown in July 2013. Sisi is expected to accept the nomination from the Supreme Council for Armed Forces, SCAF, Supreme Council for Armed Forces, and resign his military position within days. Earlier, the interim president promoted him from general to field marshal, as the BBC's Orla Gorin explains.
In command of the military, and soon, it seems, the country, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, newly promoted to Field Marshal. That looks like a parting gift from the army. He'll have to get out of uniform to contest the election. Here's the kind of backing he can muster. This was Tahrir Square on Saturday, on the anniversary of the revolution. Crowds that asked Sisi to remove the Islamist president last year were back urging him to take his place. But look what happened to Sisi's critics. They were driven from the streets by police. About 60 people were shot dead in clashes. The pharaoh in waiting was raised here, in the narrow streets of Cairo's Gamaleya district. Neighbours told us Sisi had military discipline from an early age. He had a timetable for when he studied and when he came home, said Mustafa. The other young men hung around in cafes, but not him. Many Egyptians believe that Field Marshal Sisi has the strength of character to lead the nation. They think only he is capable of rescuing the country from chaos. And after all the unrest and uncertainty of recent years, plenty of Egyptians are hankering for order and stability. Others claim he is already returning Egypt to the dark days of the past, with repression, mass arrests and extreme brutality.
I would characterize Sisi as Egypt's Pinochet, a military intelligence officer who's running one of the biggest armies here in the region. And instead of protecting the borders of this country, his bullets and his guns and his tanks are aimed at the chests of his own people.
But the people are expected to sweep him to victory. Another military strongman for Egypt, just 3 years after the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak, leaving some to ponder what revolution. Orla Guerin, BBC News, Cairo.
And friends, in our next story, we're going, well, actually, I've got another video for you on this story yet. But I wanted to give you a scripture that we've read before on this program that relates to what's happening in Egypt. And that scripture comes out of Isaiah Isaiah 19, chapter 19, verse 2, where it says, "And I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians, and they shall fight every one against his brother and every one against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom." So there's a scripture that's coming alive before your very eyes, beginning last year, July of last year, when Morsi was thrown out of office. You saw Egyptian against Egyptian, neighbor against neighbor, brother against everyone against his brother, everyone against his neighbor. I showed you some video last year, stories that showed a father and his son rivaling one another, opposing one another. And I have video from late last night. This video report was produced after our live program last night. It shows the clashes where at least, I believe it was 29 people, at least 29 people have been killed and more than 100 injured in the clashes yesterday as Egypt marks the 3rd anniversary of the 2011 uprising. Rival demonstrations, now you heard about it in this report we just gave you, but here's some video showing it from yesterday more fully. Rival demonstrations of supporters and opponents of the military-backed government took place in Cairo and other cities yesterday. Police dealt harshly with anti-government protesters in Cairo, just as you saw in the last report, but here's more detail on it. Arresting participants and opening fire on one rally. Here's Orla Guerin again from Cairo.
Tahrir Square, 3 years on. A street party at the birthplace of the revolution. It was here that crowds swept away Hosni Mubarak, a military strongman. But now many are back, looking for another one. And this may be the face of the future, General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the army chief. His supporters were showing their devotion and urging him to run for president. It felt like a Sisi election rally. He has to be our president, this man told us. No one else can do it in such difficult times. It was a state-sanctioned celebration, but some were not ready to rejoice. This man told us the goals of the revolution had not been achieved. Freedom and social justice had not come. But the Sisi supporters did not like that message, and they drowned him out. Across town, we found some of Sisi's opponents, not kissing his picture here, but tearing it up. They weren't able to protest for long. Police moved into position and, without warning, opened fire with live ammunition. 3 years after the revolution, this is the approach to dissent. Well, it didn't take long for trouble to start here. In the last few minutes, the police have been using tear gas and they've been using live rounds. We've seen them being fired. The crowd has now scattered and the heavily armed police are still in the area. The authorities have been cracking down on both Islamist and secular opponents. After what was billed as a day of celebration, Egypt is tense, divided and counting new dead. Orla Guerin, BBC News, Cairo.
And friends, before we go to the Ukraine, I've got a report that's in. We don't have video on this yet, but Israel defense computers were hit by a attack. Israeli defense computers were compromised via a malicious email attachment, a computer security firm has revealed. The email was spoofed to look like it had been sent by Israel's Shin Bet Secret Service, tricking several people into opening it. The attack left hackers temporarily in control of 15 computers that are part of Israel's defense forces. Pro-Palestinian hackers are believed to be behind the attack. Details about the attack were revealed by the chief technology officer at the Israeli firm Seculert, which helped to clean up after the hackers struck and trace which machines had fallen victim. Mr. Roth pointed the finger at Palestinian involvement because of the attack's similarity to another incident that took place in 2012. That, too, involved booby-trapped messages sent to Israeli government staff. The email messages sent in both attacks were written and formatted in a very similar style, said Mr. Raff, adding that they also shared some technical commonalities. The message purporting to come from Shin Bet included an attachment supposedly about the death of former Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. He added that it was not yet clear what the attackers did after winning access to the 15 computers in mid-January, earlier this month, middle of this month. One of the computers successfully penetrated using the booby-trapped email was Israel's Civil Administration Agency, said Mr. Raff. This defense agency issues entry permits for Palestinians who work in Israel and oversees the passage of goods between the country and the West Bank and Gaza Strip. A spokesman for the civil administration said, "We are not commenting on it. We don't respond to such reports." Mr. Raff declined to say which agencies or departments ran the other 14 compromised machines. However, a separate anonymous source told the Reuters news agency that some of the other computers were suppliers to the Israel Defense Forces. Friends, in our next report we go to the Ukraine, where Ukraine riot police stand guard in the snow. Riot police stood guard outside the regional administration building in the eastern Ukrainian city on Monday night. Now, let's see. That'd be just a few hours ago there. After anti-government protesters tried, it's midnight, it's around midnight over there now, so when they say Monday night, they're talking about 5 or 6 hours ago. Anti-government protesters tried to storm the building yesterday. The officers braved the snow to defend entrances into the building and also to protect a group of pro-government protesters who had gathered there. We've got video on this with Steve Rosenberg, who visited the scene and said the fact that that protest had spread to the region would be a major concern for Ukrainian authorities. The unrest in Ukraine began with protest in Kiev in November after President Viktor Yanukovych pulled out of a trade deal with the EU in favor of a $15 billion, £9 billion bailout from Russia.
Well, this is the regional administration building in the town of Zaporizhya in eastern Ukraine. And as you can see tonight, in this snowstorm, there are long lines of riot police guarding the entrances to the building and guarding the square here. And that is because yesterday, thousands of anti-government protesters gathered here and tried to storm the building and tried to force the governor, who's appointed by President Yanukovych, to resign. The police yesterday responded with stun grenades and with tear gas. Now the police are coming back here, there are reinforcements coming too, partly to protect the group of people you can see or just about see in the distance. About 100 people, supporters of President Yanukovych, have gathered there. They've been making speeches today in support of their president, accusing the West of fanning the flames of revolution in Ukraine and describing activists who've been occupying government buildings across Ukraine as bandits. Now this is a part of the country that you would expect to be pro-government. This is eastern Ukraine. It's a Russian-speaking part of the country. Many of the enterprises here rely heavily on the Russian market. But the fact that unrest has spread to this region too is a major concern for the Ukrainian authorities.
Okay, that was Stephen Rosenthal. Well, let me see. Just one moment, folks. I want to make sure I gave this name to you. It's exactly right. I have another. That's Steve Rosenberg. I'm sorry, Steve Rosenberg. I have an updated report from the Ukraine by the BBC's Matthew Price.
This is no longer a limited protest. It seems to be spreading to the most unexpected of places. Here, the Russian-speaking East, the president's own heartland. And some are now prepared to fight. In the capital today, a waiting game, where an uneasy truce between police and protesters is holding. Safe enough then for Ukraine's head of public safety to have a look himself. There's talk here of a state of emergency being imposed, curfews, troops on the streets.
If the government decides to impose a state of emergency, we'll do it. But we're all doing everything we can to stop it going that far.
The question now is what the president and his supporters do to break this stalemate. The protesters just over there believe that they have the momentum behind them, that it's building across the country. They also believe the president is weakened. He will have to reassert his authority very soon indeed if he's to maintain any sense of legitimacy in this country.
But he's not lost the trust of everyone here, far from it. Just up the road, outside Parliament, they have their own views on what's fueling this.
It shows that it is American invasion for American money.
It's an American invasion, these protests.
This protest, this is no our civil protest. This is a military guys who was trained for American money.
The protesters outside the Justice Ministry chanted "Glory to Ukraine." Another government building now in the hands of the opposition, where they too are waiting for the government's next move. Matthew Price, BBC News, Kiev.
Okay, thank you, Matthew Price. And friends, next we go to a report from Japan that shows a little bit of what's happening around the world economically. And that's going to have some impact, of course, on the United States and on the American dollar, and explaining Japan's huge deficit that they're having with 3 easy graphs. We've got this special report coming up. Japan has reported a record annual trade deficit of 11.5 trillion yen. Now that may sound like a lot. That's not quite $1 trillion. That's not quite even $1 trillion. It's $112 billion, or 68 billion pounds, and that's the equivalent. The 11.5 trillion yen in 2013 represents a 65% jump from a year ago. After 2 decades of stagnating growth, the country had to deal with the closure of all its nuclear reactors, and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe unveiled a series of measures dubbed Abenomics. BBC's Tokyo correspondent Rupert Wingfield Hayes, the BBC correspondent there, Rupert Wingfield Hayes, uses 3 easy graphs to explain.
So how do you explain the huge record trade deficit that Japan has just reported? Well, I'm going to try and do that with the help of 3 easy graphs. Graph number 1 is this one, and this shows the value of the Japanese currency over the last 12 months. It starts down here at 86 to the US dollar last January. And it ended the year up here at 106 to the US dollar. That is in effect a 25% devaluation in the value of the Japanese currency. And that means that Japan is paying 25% more for anything that it imports. So, what is Japan importing? Well, mainly a lot of energy. And that takes me to graph number 2. This shows how Japan generates its electricity. The red line along the top there is fossil fuels, oil, gas and coal, and the green line beneath it is nuclear power. And when we get along to the end here, 2011, you can see suddenly nuclear power drops off a cliff. That is the Fukushima nuclear disaster and the closing of all Japan's nuclear power plants. And exactly the same time above it, the red line shoots skywards. That is the huge increase in the burning of fossil fuels, and those are fossil fuels that have to be imported. Now, of course, they cost 25% more. But that's not the whole story. There is another part that is perhaps more surprising, and that takes me to graph number 3. This graph shows Japan's share of world exports over the last 20 years. And it's the red line, and you can see that it is a steady, long decline from about 12% of world exports in 1994 all the way down to 6% in 2012. And at the same time, the black line shows China's share, going from just 3% back in 1994 to above 12% today. That really is the story of our time, the migration of manufacturing from high-cost countries like Japan to low-cost countries like China. So if you put those 3 things together, the weakening of the Japanese yen, the huge increase in energy imports, and the long-term decline of exports, what you end up with is a very big trade deficit.
And friends, that trade deficit can be related to which one of the seals of Revelation, perhaps mostly. Let's take a look at our chart. We haven't had that up in the program yet tonight. This chart shows 6 of the 7 seals from the book of Revelation. This shows the 6 that are covered in chapter 6 of Revelation. The first 4 seals being the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the 5th seal being the Great Tribulation, which hasn't come yet, thankfully, and the 6th one shows the heavenly signs that come after the Great Tribulation and before the sealing of the 144,000, and all of that comes before the day of the Lord, which is the 7th seal. And I think somewhere here I have that full chart. Let's pull that up for just a moment. This full chart shows all 7 seals. Now the 7th seal, the day of the Lord, takes up the entire right side, in fact even more than half of the right side of the screen, because that day of the Lord, that 7th seal, has 7 trumpets, and the 7th trumpet has 7 last plagues. So you get your 777 out of that 7th seal, and that's a big one. But excuse me. Coming back to just the first 6 seals, the 4th one. Excuse me, friends, a little something in my throat. The 4th one is depicted in Revelation as a pale horse whose rider is named Death, alongside whom Hades, hell, the grave, rides. And Jesus Christ described the activities of this death-filled horse as loimus, disease epidemics, pestilences, the plagues of Egypt. He described it as seismus, seismic activity, commotions in the air such as all kinds of gale force winds, commotions on the ground such as earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, and tereke, meaning troubled waters, both literally and figuratively. So in many ways, this 4th seal, this pale horse and its rider named Death, relates to that tsunami that caused such devastation at the nuclear plant that you were hearing about in this last report. And Japan's not the only one having financial troubles. In today's news, one of the banks of England is having big problems, and the RBS bank boss, Ross McEwen, said the scale of bad decisions during the period of the financial crisis was to blame. Here's Robert Peston with a report from the UK on that.
It's our bank, Royal Bank of Scotland, 80% owned by taxpayers, so it's our mess. And what a mess! Another £8 billion of losses now expected in its results for 2013. What will shock many people, including taxpayers who own 80% of your bank, is that so long after the crash, you're still making these colossal losses. What went wrong?
Well, really, as you say, these losses sometime after the crash relate mainly to pre-crash times. If you look at the bulk of what we've put forward today of having to put money aside, relate back to a mortgage operation in the US. And because we were one of the largest banks in the world and had our fingers in nearly every continent and every part of the business there, we are going to be caught up in some of these.
A representative of RBS's owners, us, isn't amused.
It's an absolutely shocking story that the British taxpayers are still paying for the excesses of this bank in the boom period before it collapsed in 2008. I mean, we knew that it was bad and a lot of mistakes were made, but it's now just becoming how clear the damage was.
So where do the big new losses come from? Well, they include £1.9 billion of costs for fines and damages for mis-selling to investors. £1.1 billion of losses for compensating people mis-sold PPI credit insurance and small businesses who were mis-sold interest rate protection. That brings to a staggering £40 billion the losses suffered by the bank since 2008. Perhaps surprisingly, given this horror show, RBS is consulting shareholders, including the Treasury, on whether it should pay bonuses worth 2 times salaries to senior bankers next year. But the bank has cancelled all bonuses for 2013 for its top 6 executives.
And friends, tomorrow night, that's the bulk of that story right there. Tomorrow night we're going to show you a very special BBC feature that shows how World War I's financial crisis parallels with the 2008 crisis. Be sure to tune in for that tomorrow night. That's it for tonight, friends. Thank you for joining me. God willing and the creek don't rise, we'll be back again tomorrow night, Tuesday night, for our next edition. Until then, your host Stephen Lloyd saying, so long, friends.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth. Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on cogtv.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the cogtv.org video archive.